speaking of letters of recommendation, what advice do you have for applicants around that, about professors versus employers or other people out there, like a random friend of a friend who's a senator or something like that?
Right. And gosh, that random friend of a friend who's a senator is the question I probably get the most.
Yeah.
And it's such an easy way for me to say no. Because listen, unless it's Barack Obama, who, I'm not buddies, but if I were, I might have him write me a letter of recommendation. It's really the person who knows you and can speak to your academic ability. I think sometimes applicants jump right over law school when they're thinking about it and head right to their career. And they're forgetting that they're applying to an academic institution. And that institution's first goal, before it makes you a lawyer, is to have you be a successful student. And so it really wants to know if you can perform in the classroom. And so for many candidates, some schools require 2 letters be academic or strongly encourages that. Other schools are a little more relaxed. But I think that the academic letters actually carry the most weight for many schools, especially the more prestigious schools. Of course, if you've been out of school for a very long time, it may not be feasible or even possible. And the people who can speak to your abilities may be your employers. So of course, you have to use your judgment on that one. But I think many people forget about the academic side and how important it is. So I always look first for the really strong academic recommendations. And on that, again, like someone might say, oh, well, I know the chair of the department. And I say, yes, but does she know you? It's the professor from whom you took classes. Even if she's an associate professor or an assistant professor, even, it doesn't matter. It's the professor who knows your work and understands your ability and can speak to you personally.
That makes a lot of sense. The personal connection, of course, would be the most compelling, I would think. But let's say an applicant, they're towards the end of college, but they're not going to apply to law school for a few years. And they're worried that the professor might not remember them by that point because it's let's say it's 3 to 5 years later. Would you have any advice for someone in terms of maintaining a connection with the professor or some sort of prep to supply them with appropriate materials to write a letter?
Yeah, I mean, letters need to be fresh, so you can't just procure letters now. I think that would be a little strange. But what you can do is say, hey, Professor X, I'm planning to apply to law school in a couple of years. I'd be so grateful if you could write me a positive letter of recommendation. And then the professor would say, oh, yes, I'd be thrilled. Or maybe you should ask someone else, right? In whatever polite way to decline. So I think it's definitely worth having that conversation. And if you've had that, then, you just stay in touch. It's not that hard to stay in touch. I went to college a long time ago, so it was a little different then. But, with social media and social networking platforms and, old-fashioned email, I think it's not too hard to be in touch with someone once or twice a year just to keep that relationship alive. And then, on that sort of refresher thing, I always encourage applications, even if it's just been a few months, to say, hey, Professor X, I took this class with you. I did this project with you. I really enjoyed learning this. I'm applying to law school, right? Jog his or her memory, because of course that professor is teaching dozens or maybe hundreds of students a year. So even if it's a recent professor, you definitely help him or her out.
Yeah, I love that idea. Just even like once or twice a year to stay on their radar in some way. I could imagine that translating into, increased familiarity and freshness when it does come time to actually write that letter, even if it's a few years later.
Absolutely. I mean, I think people can be intimidated by keeping in touch with someone, but there's really no reason, right? There's no reason. This is someone who does like you and appreciate you as a student. And so, I mean, I wouldn't bombard him with your Instagram every day, but a little relationship can go
right.
along.
And it's also not the most important professor. It's the one that maybe you have the closer relationship with.
It's not status, it's relationship, because that's the person who can say, this is one of my best students in all the years I've taught, right? Not the one who says, oh, her GPA was this, and I know she wrote a senior thesis. That's not helpful to you at all. And it's the same thing with professional recommendations, right? You don't need the CEO of the company. You need usually your direct supervisor. And it's great to have a friend of a friend of a friend who's a judge, but not really unless you worked for that judge.
Right. Law schools aren't really going to care because they're going to know the person doesn't know you if the letter is somewhat generic.
Yeah, it's pretty obvious. And so it's just not helpful. And if it's not helpful, it's hurtful. So don't do it.
Yeah. What about, so let's say we're talking professors, you want to choose a professor, you presumably got a good grade in that class, and you're asking them for the letter. But let's say your overall GPA in college wasn't high. Maybe you had a lot of required classes in math or science, and you're more of a humanities pre-law kind of person, which I think most applicants are. What do you recommend for someone who just has this low GPA? Do you recommend maybe like selecting out the in major GPA because it looks better, or is it not worth playing any of those games?
I don't think it's a game to say in your personal statement or even on your resume listing the in major GPA. I mean, schools are looking at that compiled GPA that they get in the report, but because of that, yes, definitely. I mean, I had a good friend in college who was pre-med, and then later she decided to go to law school. Her grades definitely were not as high as mine, but she, of course, rightly pointed out in her application succinctly and not belaboring the point, but, pointed out that in her courses, a C was an average, whereas in my courses, a C was definitely not an average as a philosophy major.